Birth rates in the US and Europe are low, well below replacement rate. There are many reasons, but one key reason is it's difficult to conceive by the time many people are ready, in their 30s or even their 40s. In vitro fertilization, or IVF, is a proven technology for assisted reproduction. It can also be really expensive and hard to access. My guest today, Marty Gauvin, is CEO of Fertilis, which is working to democratize IVF through automation. Marty is a serial entrepreneur in Adelaide, Australia. He and his wife are parents of 6 children. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. Marty, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David.
So we're going to talk about your current venture, but you've had several beforehand. And I'll start all the way back at childhood. And I always like to ask about what your upbringing was like, if there's any childhood influences that have stuck with you through your career.
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably 2 things I would say. Firstly, both my father and my maternal grandfather were entrepreneurs. So I grew up in an environment where sort of starting your own business wasn't the exception. And when I turned 18, my father had a dinner where he brought along his lawyer and his accountant and his bank manager, and he said, these are the people you're going to need to work with. And so, yeah, I tell that to a lot of entrepreneurs and they go, God, I wish my dad did that. And then the other influence for me was I had quite a lot of exposure to the healthcare system from a very early age. I was born with something that's not a particularly big issue, but it did mean that I was in hospital and having surgeries a lot as a kid. And so I guess I'm comfortable with the healthcare sector, but I'm also exposed to its weaknesses.
Got it. So, as I mentioned, it was on your LinkedIn profile, so I thought I could mention it. Number of kids that you have. I only have 4, but we have 10 between us, which would be enough to be above replacement rate if we averaged it out, I think.
But we would be doing well. A friend of mine, when I told him that we were pregnant again and we were going to be having our 6th, he said, even numbers are good. I said, yeah, it depends which even number.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah. But I wanted to ask you, you told me what your dad did when you turned 18. Have you done something similar with your kids, or do you have a different philosophy, and does it vary by kid?
Look, I think one of the things that I would say is that every kid is different and you need to treat them as that. But one of the things my kids have all at different times come to me with, and this is the most satisfying thing from me as a parent to have ever heard, is they've all said, thank you for supporting me in whatever I wanted to do. And so that's absolutely something that I would be very happy with. I think my father was very keen for me to be an entrepreneur, and so he helped me to do that. I'm very keen for my kids to be a soldier or an entrepreneur or a scientist or a circus performer. And now I have all those things.
Good. That sounds excellent. So for schooling, it looks like you studied computer science. Is that right? How'd you get into that, and what was that like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started at about the age of 12. I started to read up on the computer language BASIC. My school had bought their first Apple II, and I thought this is pretty interesting. And so I kind of joined the Computer Society back when schools sort of had one computer, sort of in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And ultimately became the president of the Computer Society at my school, and then ended up training the staff, which was sort of an interesting way to get, I guess, the kickoff to my whole career. So computer science at university was then just essentially a support mechanism for me to start my first company. So I started my first company, which was a computer consulting business called GCL Systems, with a couple of friends from school. Back in literally as soon as we had all finished school, we were only just about to turn 18 when we formed that company, and we ran that through university. And I've only ever had a boss twice since then. I don't make a good staff member.
That's good. Well, we won't use this show to get you hired anywhere then.
Yeah, that's it.
But that's good. So you started right into it, and then I saw a company, HostWorks. What was that?
Yeah, so HostWorks was a was my first sort of, I guess, decent sized company. I had an opportunity where, because of some connections my boss at the time had, where his best man from his wedding ended up running MSN, the Microsoft network as it was back in
Yeah.
those days in Australia. And Microsoft had set about a mission to bring MSN to the internet with the introduction of Windows 95. So this is going back a long way.
Yeah.
And so they'd already established data centers in Seattle, obviously, in London, in Tokyo. And the guys who were here in Australia said, we need something in our part of the world. And so because of the connections, I had the opportunity to pitch it to Microsoft that it should be in Adelaide and that I and my team should run it. And, obviously bigger cities, Sydney, Melbourne were very much in the running. And that conversation was pretty interesting because I got my first exposure to kind of creating a mini Microsoft. They said to me, so why should we put this with you? Why should we give it the job to you? We've got these other people with, lots of resources and so forth. I said, well, because we know this market, we know how to run things, both from a market and engineering perspective, better than you do in Australia. And they said, prove it.
Yeah.
So we did.
Nice. Well, anyway, Windows 95 was the one to get in on because you didn't want to wait for Windows 98, which I think was probably the worst Windows version ever.
Yeah. It's a long-held view that Microsoft products kind of alternate between good and not so good.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was the beginning.
Yeah. 98, I think, was kind of the nadir, but
Yeah.
nonetheless. And then how about Virtual Arc? That's another one that stands out on your CV.
Yeah, so Virtual Arc was a business where basically I'd got out of Hostworks, had a sort of decent exit there, and it was like, well, okay, now I want to do something in the cloud computing universe. And so Virtual Arc actually still operates, but has had some really interesting businesses that it's engaged with. So it was involved in building the air transport industry cloud in years gone by. So for all of the global airlines. Building a very large scale SMS environment for sending out text messages and so forth across the US, and then things like consulting on a system for mental health records across the whole of Australia. So yeah, we essentially our slogan in Virtual Arc has been we don't do boring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty much the basis on which I've built my whole career.
Yeah.
I really don't handle boredom that well.
Now, I've seen that you're on and have been on various advisory boards, and I wonder, are they all related to one another, or what's the role there, and what's the interest in participating that way?
So I'm really interested in the way in which innovation and entrepreneurship happens, particularly, I guess, in Australia where I live. And trying to make that kind of stuff move forward more effectively. And so I've played a pretty key role in terms of the regulation of things like R&D programs, but also venture capital. And so I've been involved in the venture capital industry here as it's grown from about $30 million to about $3 billion. And so that was interesting and fun, and sort of understanding the way in which those funds are building in maturity and building in scale. So obviously it's still a small industry compared to the US, but it's creeping into sort of the global top 10 in terms of VC ecosystems.
So I want to talk now about Fertilis, which is the company that you're running now. And I guess at first blush, it seems in some ways different from some of the other ventures that you've been in. I don't think of fertility as necessarily an IT kind of an issue or even an entrepreneurial one. So how did you come about getting involved with this company?
Sure. Well, it certainly is an engineering type one, and I guess an engineering and entrepreneurial one because I think the thing that underpins what you just said, David, is people think of IVF as fertility as a solved problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it really isn't. And so, if you go into the path of IVF, then roughly speaking, you have about a 20% chance of having a baby, without taking then further cycles to to go further, and that chance drops away if you are older, if you've got multiple causes of infertility and things like that. But as well as that chance, that sort of process chance being low, access is super low. So another great stat is that in America, there's about 14 million people affected by infertility today. Less than 1% of those will have a baby this year through IVF. And so you combine effectively the low success rate with the low access to this treatment, and it's still got some major, major gaps in it, major, major holes. And when you combine that with the things you were saying in your introduction about how fertility rates are falling, we have a situation at the moment where in the US, only a couple of % of babies are born through IVF. Even in Japan, where birth rates are exceptionally low, it's still only 7%. And that's with no end of government support and so forth. And so there's got to be a reason. And the reason from our perspective is it's supply constrained. So these are extremely precise, extremely kind of artisan treatments that are conducted in ways and conducted by people that have been trained. If I say something a bit controversial, these people have been trained as if they were 16th century blacksmiths.
Yeah.
They've been trained by a master teaching the pupil, and that's consuming the time of the master and the time of the pupil. So wouldn't it be great if we could automate this so that we could bring on the Industrial Revolution essentially to the way in which this works? But apart from those sort of analogies in terms of industrialization, also then deliver something that is much more repeatable, precise, and controlled. Because we do know that what happens when you're dealing with embryos, the enemy is stress. And if you say what stresses an embryo, almost anything.
Yeah.
So right now, if you're going through IVF, one of the things that your specialist may tell you, but you can imagine, is that often during that process from when the egg is first fertilized through to the point that it's reimplanted, it's sitting in an incubator. But in order to check it, to see how it's going, people are opening the incubator door. People are taking it out. People are moving it around and putting it under a microscope. That's all pretty stressful.
Mm-hmm.
So what about if we could actually just leave it where it is? And what about if we could control that environment really, really well? So it's not just around not sort of sloshing the liquid it's in, the media, as you're moving the dish from place to place, but also let's control the composition of that media so that as the needs of the embryo change, we can react and we can change the environment that it's in. And it turns out that all of the treatments that are part of the way IVF works are amenable to that kind of shift. And as an engineer and an entrepreneur, I've been able to learn about a lot of that from my co-founders, Professor Jeremy Thompson and Professor David Gardner. I'm not an embryologist. They are not just embryologists. They are probably top 10 and top 1. So David is currently the embryologist of the year globally.
Great. So how did you get together with this group?
So Jeremy lives in my hometown, Adelaide, and our daughters went to elementary school together. And so we've known each other for years. And I actually rang him back in late 2018. I rang him with a business idea. I said, and eventually I tracked him down at a conference in Cairo, and we got on the phone and said, I've got this business idea that I'd like you to get involved in. He said, that's funny. I've got a business idea I'd like to get you involved in. Both businesses are ticking along quite well, but yeah, Fertilis is the one that is going better. So yeah, his idea won.
Fair enough. Well, maybe you'll get to yours eventually as well. So what kind of approaches, how much does this vary around the world? Human anatomy, human biology doesn't really change very much from where you go, but there's a lot of differences in terms of how treatments are administered. Certainly the financing of the system's access varies, cultural attitudes. How much variability is there with fertility?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of treatment, there's not a whole lot of difference. But in terms of access, there is a big difference. And this is why we say it's supply constrained. Because if you look at countries like Belgium and Israel, the rate of IVF treatments per million population is like 7 to 14 times as high as it is in the US.
Yeah.
Massively higher. And so human existence is not that inconsistent. And we're talking about a biological urge here, the biological urge to have your own children. And so you've got to say, well, the rest of the world should be at the Belgium and Israel level, at least. Now, when you talk to people in Belgium and Israel and Australia, which is also quite high, we still know that it's supply constrained. It still shows all the signs of a supply constrained market. And so if you could then make it possible for everyone to have access to the treatment, and even in Japan, where they've started giving out subsidies to anyone, the birth rate hasn't substantially shifted because all their clinics are full. All their clinics are as busy as they can be. And so it becomes an issue of training new embryologists, which is obviously one of the areas we come in on. So that's a big shift. One of the sort of things that is a little bit unusual is the low rate in the US, and that's probably significantly triggered by cost. So, IVF everywhere is expensive. There's no question at all. It's a seriously expensive treatment. And one of the things for access for us is around, firstly, we need to get more embryologists. We need to get more places for people to go and more less of a queue. And we also, for access, we need to lower the cost. But in terms of this, lowering even if you look at the sort of the unsubsidized cost in the US and you look at the unsubsidized costs everywhere else, unsubsidized costs in the US are probably 60, 70% higher than anywhere else.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking to lower them elsewhere. So one of the things we've done, for example, our first product is called Micro ICSI. ICSI has a very complicated name, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, but some people have seen the idea of injecting a very fine needle into an egg under a microscope. We automate that. And we automate that very effectively, so it improves the success rate, but also it becomes much easier to do in much less time and with less training of the embryologist. So we halve the time that it takes to do that procedure. So we therefore should be able to double the rate of it and potentially halve the cost of it.
Got it. I mean, I know in the US I had some exposure to this business several years ago before there was so much inflation, and your typical reproductive endocrinologist made well over $1 million. A lot of them had their own planes, and it was pretty cushy. And they actually didn't want the states to become so-called mandate states where insurance was required. Instead, they preferred the out-of-pocket, and maybe because of the supply constraint, you'd rather do fewer procedures for more money than to have to negotiate with the insurance company. So I'm not sure how that movement has changed, but I wonder what you think about the possibility. Let's say if your solution is introduced and you're able to double or quadruple the productivity, the throughput, is that going to translate into more IVF being done, do you think?
Definitely on a global basis. I don't know the US market as well as I know some of the other markets such as Europe and Japan and China. Europe and Japan and China are the biggest markets for IVF in the world. US, whole of North America is a relatively small market, probably impacted by cost and supply and other factors like that. And yes, I think that it'll mean that more IVF will be done for two reasons. One is because, as I said before, it's essentially a biological urge to have children. And so the extent to which people will pay is very high, but the extent to which people are able to pay has a limit. So if you then can lower the cost and increase the availability to the point that it fits within some other people's budgets, then they will go get it. The other part of it, though, is that fertility is falling. And we know this not just because of kind of looking at the global population stats, but there's been heaps of studies about male fertility, for example. Now, male fertility is falling at something like between 2.3 and 3.6% per year. So one way of looking at this is it halves every generation.
Yeah.
So my sons are half as likely to have their own children as I am, and that will then carry forward to their sons.
Yeah. Is there a consensus on the reason for that?
So I guess the consensus is environment and lifestyle. So obesity, chronic health conditions, microplastics, toxic chemicals, kind of you name it.
Yeah.
Sperm in some ways are the canary in the coal mine.
Right.
Um, Almost anything that happens is going to reduce your ability to produce viable sperm. And the body does a fairly good job of discarding sperm that won't work, or failing to progress an embryo that won't be viable. And so you see the net effect of a reduction in fertility being a reduction in live birth rate may mean that you can't conceive, or it may mean that you can't produce an embryo that goes to term. And so the sort of complexities of all of that mean that IVF provides you with a chance of circumventing some of those natural mechanisms, but also you can filter for those issues and remove the problem. Ultimately, where that gets you to potentially is a situation where IVF becomes the norm. But yeah, we're still probably, it's certainly a problem for us in the next 150, 200 years if we continue on the direction we're on.
Yeah. I suppose also if you combine that, I think you're speaking of fertility probably at a given age, but if you also look at the, later marriage or later time that people want to have kids, that it's a compounding effect. And I'm wondering how that shift has affected things, and maybe if there's any sort of, myths about older parents, or, what are some of the things that kind of get in the way of success there?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's really interesting because the human egg is entirely influenced by the age of its ability to be successful is entirely influenced by the age of the egg. So, for example, we know that a 50-year-old mother can carry a baby to term, quite successfully, and a 50-year-old father can fertilize an egg quite successfully. But a 50-year-old mother's eggs are going to be the problem. So if you can harvest eggs early, and can talk a little bit about some of the advances in technology in doing that, then an embryo produced by IVF with an egg harvested from a 20 or 30-year-old mother has as much chance of success as when that mother was 20 or 30 years old. And so egg freezing can extend the fertility into now what we find matches people's chosen way of rolling out their lives. I went to a talk by a demographer years ago, and he said there's a really important change that started around about World War One. He said that before World War One there was no such thing as adolescence, and that gradually came into being after World War One as between 18 and 14 and 18. He said now adolescence ends at 30.
Yeah.
And I went, yeah, now I get it. Particularly with 6 kids, I absolutely get it.
Yeah. Even if you didn't get it the first couple times.
Yes. So yes. So I all my kids that are below 30 are essentially big children. And this is why you're seeing this shift out to life's big occasions. Now, when people get to 40 and they go, okay, now I've got a career, now I've got a partner, now I've got someone I can put up with. I've been through the fur babies, I've had a dog, all that kind of stuff. Right, babies, and you go, okay, so the chance of conceiving naturally for a 40-year-old parents is about 2%.
Yeah.
And even in IVF, it's way lower than it would be if the egg was from a 20-year-old. There's a bunch of things that we can do to improve those chances, but it's always going to be quite a bit less. So your best option is to, at the moment, is harvest eggs earlier. One of the treatments that we can optimize, one of the things we're working with at the moment is this technique called IVM, which is in vitro maturation. Harvesting eggs is disruptive. It's unpleasant. You've got to go through all of this hormone treatment and
Yeah.
so forth to force the eggs to be matured and produced in volume. IVM is about harvesting the eggs early, effectively harvesting the follicles off the ovary, and then maturing them in a petri dish. And so that's a far less disruptive issue for the patient. And so a woman can have those eggs harvested and then matured and frozen and so forth. So we certainly see that as a procedure. At the moment, it's got a fairly low take-up rate, but it's one of the procedures that can help offset the age point that you mentioned.
Yeah, so there's a lot of hand-wringing about the difficulty of increasing, the birth rate. You see it in places like certainly in Europe, about Italy and other places where they'll give a big, even in Canada, they give a bonus for having kids. It doesn't seem to have really much of an impact, if any. And I wonder what you think about if we take sort of your technology and increase access. Is it going to make potentially a meaningful difference? And any idea of what sort of the order of magnitude impact could be?
So there's a great example, a sort of a thought experiment that you can go through, which I think proves the extent to which it'll make a difference. Almost every IVF child around the world is an only child. Almost the only exceptions to those are when people have gone through IVF and then they've had a second child naturally, which obviously people love telling those stories. But people don't go through a second IVF child. It's extremely costly. It's extremely disruptive. And it's extremely distressing. It's emotionally taxing to go through so many failed pregnancies, miscarriages, and so on and so forth. If we can improve the success rate of IVF so that you can expect to have a baby from an IVF cycle, and that's what we want to do. That's that's the first step for us. You should be able to expect to have a baby from an IVF cycle. Then we can see that IVF parents who really clearly want to have parents or they wouldn't have started on this journey can then have a second one. And so that's the kind of step change that we would see kicking off this straight off. We also see that the whole issue about age is also something that we can take away a cycle from. And so people who start their IVF treatment at the mother is 38 or something like that, and then they might get 2 cycles and then they go, yep, the chances now are too low. But if we can deliver success within those 2 cycles rather than maybe it would have taken 4 before, well, then they'll have had a baby. And so we see ourselves, in effect, being able to help in both those ways to significantly make a difference and make it possible, make it expected, really, for infertile couples to be able to have a child.
Marty, I'm going to ask you a final question, which doesn't have to do with your business unless you want it to, which is if there's any good books you've read lately, if there's anything you would recommend to our listeners.
Interesting. Currently reading Gödel Escher Bach by Hofstadter, and I find it interesting to think. I spend most of my time thinking in my businesses. It's useful to be able to think on the business, and when I think on the process of fertility, it's an incredibly complicated thing that is coloured by emotion. It's almost impossible to speak about in a really clearly rational, simple, objective way. And so, I like to be able to bring my brain to sort of a logic process to think about how do I make things logically better by stripping away the stuff that is not important to that.
Great. Well, Marty Gauvin, CEO of Fertilis, serial entrepreneur, thank you for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast.
Thanks, David.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.